Alright, let's watch this video. It says how Tony Hawk's Pro Skater changed music forever, and I'll keep blowing. It's milk.
What's up, everybody? I'm Philly20. This is the Punk Rock NBA, and today we're here to talk about Tony Hawk Pro Skater, a series of games that I'm guessing most of you are familiar with. Not only are they great games, but they really had an impact
That doesn't count
on
as
culture in general, getting millions and millions of kids into skateboarding, but especially into music. Like, how many people heard bands like Dead Kennedys, Suicidal Tendencies, Goldfinger, or AFI from a Tony Hawk game? And that was the beginning of everything for them, going down the rabbit hole of punk and hardcore and metal.
That is such a cool effect.
Watching this right now, right? And if you think about the early to mid-2000s as being the last big moment for rock, I think Tony Hawk Pro Skater was a crucial part of what made those years so great. It gave a massive platform to punk and hardcore and metal, with tens of millions of copies sold, making it pretty much bigger than anything else at that time. So what exactly happened? What was the impact of Tony Hawk Pro Skater on music and pop culture in general? And what eventually killed the franchise? Those are the questions that I will answer in this video. But first, if you haven't, please check me out on Twitch. I'm streaming twice a week from 4 to 7 p.m. Pacific on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Hit the link in the description of
I was like,
video.
homie with the Twitch shout out. Let's have a look. 2 years ago? Do you think he's earned my follow? 3 years ago! Dang. I don't like to follow dead accounts. Dang, though. I'm sad.
First, if you haven't, please check me out on Twitch. I'm streaming twice a week from 4 to 7 p.m. Pacific on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And there's a link to that in the description of this video.
You can buy Vegemite at Cost Plus International Market.
Was such a special, important game. It's important to understand the context. Tony Hawk was far from the first skateboarding game. There were several attempts at skateboarding games in the 80s, like California Games, Tennessee Wood and Water Raid, Skate or Die, and especially 720 Degrees, which unfortunately were all terrible games. In a few games in the 90s, like Street Skater for PS1,
yeah, that one was kind of
which were somewhat better, but honestly, still pretty bad games. First of all, on a technical level, most of those games just didn't really capture the feel of skateboarding at all, didn't get the tricks right, stuff like that. But equally important to the technical stuff, they didn't get the culture of skateboarding right either. These games felt like they were made by people who not only
we can get
skate,
volume,
but really just didn't know or care about skateboarding in general. And so when Tony Hawk Pro Skater came out in the fall of 1999, everybody I know expected it to suck, because even though Tony Hawk had his name on it and we're all fans of his, still skateboarding games always suck, right? So why would this one be any different? But of course, in hindsight, we were wrong. This game didn't suck at all. Actually, it was fucking amazing. For the first time, somebody actually made a good skateboarding game. They got it right. The team at Neversoft, who are the developers that created the game, had a lot of serious skateboarders on their team, and it showed. The tricks were technically correct. The way that you put lines together made sense to a skateboarder, like ollieing into a grind and then doing a flip trick out of it.
The tricks were technically correct, apart from one faithful error. Switch, nollie, Tony Hawk, you let that one slip. How dare you? Nah, I think he corrected it in number 2, but you could switch nollie in Tony Hawk's 1, so shout out to switch nollie.
It felt
which
like
technically is a trick, I guess.
Except, you know, if you had the athletic ability of a superhero and you could pull off tricks that no human being ever possibly could. Really quick, before we go any further, I wanted to mention my Discord. We're up to over 5,000 people now hanging out.
Damn, homie with the sponsoring himself a lot on this video.
You are invited. All you need to do is click the link in the description of this video. But
what's a VOC?
Importantly to the technical stuff, they also got the cultural part right, unlike all the games that came before them. They got 10 of the best pro skaters in the game, like Chad Muska, Jamie Thomas, Kareem Campbell, and Bob Burnquist, in addition to, of course, Tony Hawk himself. They also got brands in there like Zero, Toy Machine, and Shorties. They just really showed their attention to detail, and it felt like they were really doing their best to accurately represent skateboarding and skateboarders. And of course, the crown jewel to all of this was the soundtrack. where, once again, they went the extra mile to do this right. As Tony Hawk explains in his book, How Did I Get Here? The music was another important aspect.
Tony Hawk has a book?
In uncharted territory, so Activision gave us permission to use the music
think he actually wrote it?
skateboarding soundtrack in the late 1970s
I did not know that.
and early 1980s punk rock. I was stoked to expose a new crowd to the tunes that I'd grown up with. We were proud of our counterculture pursuit, and these were its anthems. Which is exactly right. The soundtrack to Tony Hawk Pro Skater had some very legit punk and hardcore bands, including Suicidal Tendencies, The Vandals, and Dead Kennedys. Some ska punk, like
if anyone else said that, it would be weird, but
Machines.
from you, it's normal.
As well as some progressive, like kind of punk adjacent, just generally weird bands like
I don't know what you guys are talking about. 2 hours into her latest stream on Twitch, she shows it. Uh-oh, what does that mean? Shows what? Tony
And
Hawk
it's
book
kind of
reading?
ironic to me
I'm
because
down.
this is not the soundtrack that you would put together if you thought this game was going to be some sort of mainstream hit, right? Because internally at Activision, the game was forecasted to be kind of a modest success. They were expecting
Yeah,
to
that's
sell
kind of
500
true,
to
actually.
700,000 copies in the first year, which would be okay, but definitely not a hit by any means.
None
Which
of your
thanks to it
business?
being,
I'm
number
scared.
one,
She better
a
not
great
pop all
game,
my
but
balloons.
also
I'll
some
be
good
bummed.
luck. That forecast
she has
ended up
something to
being
pop them.
very, very wrong. And what set all of that up is that Tony Hawk had become the mainstream face of skateboarding thanks to the ESPN X Games, which was kind of like the Olympics of action sports, and put skateboarding in front of a huge mainstream TV audience that otherwise would have never gone into a skate shop or read a copy of Transworld or Thrasher, and certainly would have never bought a punk album.
Damn, this
In a
guy's
few
name
months
dropping.
before the release of the game, after trying for years and years and years, Tony Hawk landed the very first ever 900 live on ESPN in front of millions and millions of people. And this became kind of like an actual like national level news story that was picked up by tons of mainstream news media. And
Yeah.
so when the game
Isn't that
came out
crazy?
later that summer,
Honestly, I think this
story
This
that was
face?
picked up by tons of mainstream.
This face right there made everything. If he didn't react like that, if he was a robot, it wouldn't have been as big of a deal. And shout out to the MC too, because look at this. Look at this, right? This was however many years later, 20 years later, the first 1260, so a full extra rotation, not half rotation, a full extra rotation. He goes way higher. He drops in switch. Boom, 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 boom. Like world's first, singular only time it's done, but look at his reaction. Look, he's just like, It's because it's such a crazy thing. He is almost in like, disbelief. He's just like, He's like, I did not die. I cannot believe I did not die. Look, let me see. Look, they're more hyped than he is. He's just like, I will knee slide down now. Okay, he's not even smiling. That's, man, I love Mitchie, right? But isn't that crazy? He's just, and compare that to this. Boom. I achieved my 10-year dream. This guy's like, yep, I broke skateboarding. I will slide down. Looks like his dog died. Look, even here he's not even hyped. What the heck? Like, I understand he's in like shock. Like, I think he's in shock, and he's in a comp, and he's trying to win or whatever. But like, there's a little bit of emotion. He's still not even smiling. They're smiling more than him, and they're his competitors. Like, these guys are hype. His brain is scrambled, yeah. I mean, people deal with things in different ways, and like, I think he can't believe that he did it.
And another spin looks a little bit low on the landing,
but anyway, what I was saying is, I think this level of hype, and that it was on live TV, and that it was such a big event, like this guy said, it's national news. I think that is 100% why.
news media. And so when the game came out later that summer, skateboarding in general, as well as his profile as an individual, were at an all-time high. And because the game was great, it got incredible reviews, word of mouth spread really quickly. And
yeah, Tony Hawk didn't even win the comp.
It
was off the time.
7 million
and he still won.
Over 10 times that initial forecast. And given its soundtrack was made up mostly of those punk and hardcore metal bands that had never been on major labels, that was many times more albums that every band on the soundtrack had sold combined. And this soundtrack was not just background music. One of the special things about the game is that unlike a lot of other games where maybe you beat it...
He actually did win the comp. Even though he technically didn't win the comp, I think they gave him the medal. But what's funny with Mitchie's one is he didn't win the comp. He came second. He lost the comp, which is insane to me. Like, I think no matter what happens, even if you win the medal, you say, yo, you did the 1260, you win, brother.
You throw it in your closet and never play it again. Tony Hawk was the kind of game that you would play over and over and over again, maybe for years. And so the impact of that is that now there were millions and millions of suburban kids who had heard bands like the Vans and Suicidal Tendencies hundreds, if not thousands of times, to the point where these songs were burned into their brains. This is the kind of game where you play it so many times that you know every word and every note of every song on this soundtrack, even the songs that you hate. And so these songs really did become anthems for this generation. And as one example of the soundtrack's impact, I'm convinced that this soundtrack is responsible for like 80% of Goldfinger's current fan base. Their song Superman became kind of like the unofficial theme song of the series, and now is today still regarded as a classic. So here I am, doing everything I can. And for the kids who grew up on this game, for them, Tony Hawk Pro Skater was the same as how I discovered bands like The Descendants and Social Distortion from skate videos when I was a kid. To me, it really felt like the skate culture of my youth had like gone undercover and somehow ended up invading homes all across the country and really the world. And so you have to think, of the millions and millions of kids who played this game for like hundreds of hours, how many of those millions of kids heard Police Truck by the Dead Kennedys in Tony Hawk? And that was the beginning of them going down the rabbit hole of punk and hardcore. I don't know what the exact number is, but it's got to be a lot. And on the back of that success, Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2 came out in 2000 and was really just bigger and better than the first game in every way. In my personal opinion, it's the best game in the series, especially the Dreamcast version, which I played until my thumbs were like literally almost bleeding from that super sharp Dreamcast D-pad. And to me, it was kind of like the perfect balance. It was more polished and fully featured than the first game, but still relatively grounded in feeling like actual skateboarding. Although obviously exaggerated and over the top because it was a video game, and at the end of the day, the goal is to have fun. As compared to some of the other games that were coming out, like the Thrasher game, which was more of, I guess, like a skateboarding simulation that was more realistic than Tony Hawk, but really wasn't that much fun to play. And as highly reviewed as the first game was, Tony Hawk 2 got even better reviews. And to this day, it's considered an all-time classic. It's actually the second highest reviewed game of all time on Metacritic, just below Zelda Ocarina of Time. It introduced a bunch of new features like manuals, Create a Park and Create a Skater, and added some skateboarders that a lot of people missed from the first game, like Eric Austin and especially Ryan. And they also expanded the soundtrack quite a bit.
My skateboard rack just fell apart loud as hell, dang.
And Lagwagon, some more like mainstream rock like Rage Against the Machine, Power Man 5000, and Papa Roach, as well as the addition of quite a few rap songs like Naughty by Nature and Dub Pistols. And if I had to point to one band that I would say probably got the biggest bump from the soundtrack, it would be Millencolin and their song No Cigar.
Why did that look like an AI
Up
image?
until that point, Millencolin was really a pretty unknown Swedish pop punk band, but Pro Skater 2 really put them on the map in America, and to this day they have a cult following of people who probably discovered them from this game. And also Bad Religion. On the one hand, it feels like maybe that's a little bit of an overstatement because Bad Religion had already been a band for like 20 years at this point, but at the same time there is a part of me that thinks this game is at least somewhat responsible for the really large following that they still have to this day. I think it also helped a lot of people discover Bring the Noise by Anthrax and Public Enemy, especially people who were too young to have heard the song when it first came out.
How long can you go?
And with so much success, of course, it was followed by Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3 the following year. Activision did what Activision always does, and they had already started to turn this series into an annual franchise. And for this game, they added the Revert and online multiplayer, which were cool, as well as a bunch of unlockable characters like Wolverine and Darth Maul. And I'm probably in the minority here, but for me, this is where the series started to feel a little bit cartoonish, but maybe that's just me. But still, overall, it was a great game. And the soundtrack was equally great with a really nice mix of rock, punk, and rap. Some classic bands like Ramones, Motorhead, and Adolescent. Newer bands like Zebrahead and Guttermouth.
Ricky THPS
and rap
retrospective.
like Del the Funky, Homo Sapien, and Exhibit. And if I was to pick two artists who I think maybe got a particularly significant bump from this game, one would be AFI with The Boy Who Destroyed the World. Tony Hawk credit for their success by any means, because AFI was clearly on an upward trajectory already. But this game did sell millions of copies and made a lot of people aware of the band. And their next album, Sing the Sorrow, was their big breakout success.
Duck Station.
The game did help. And also
then
CKY with
PCS2 or whatever. And then RPSC3. Oh, wait, what did you say about CKY? Allegedly, of course. Below the Aldi.
Now, of course, tons of people had already discovered them from CKY2K. I think they were probably also on Jackass at this point. But this game, I think, really helped them reach an even bigger mainstream audience outside the kind of core skateboarding world that was already familiar with them. And if it seems like I'm kind of skipping over the rap stuff on these soundtracks, there's actually a reason for that. Because although the soundtracks pretty much always included a lot of rap songs, and rap has been a big part of skateboarding since the early 90s, like when I started getting into it around like 92 or so, that's when skate videos would have Funk Dubious or Far Side on the soundtrack instead of punk. But still, it really feels to me like the soundtracks never really had the same kind of influence with rap as they did with rock. But I could be wrong about that. Let me know in the comments if you think I am. Which brings us to the next game in the series, Tony Hawk Pro Skater 4, which to me felt like kind of just more of Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3. Not a bad thing by any means, but I didn't feel like the soundtrack had any real particular special cultural impact. And that brings us to the next game in the series where the spin-off started, Tony Hawk's Underground in 2003. And they switched up the format quite a bit for this one. For one, it was the first game in the series with an actual plot. You play an up-and-coming skater trying to get sponsored and go pro. And in the course of doing that, you go on a wild adventure around the world and do all kinds of crazy stuff, like riding around in a Russian tank.
Oh yeah, come on to the bridge!
What game is where you had Stumpy in the zoo?
It also goes beyond just skateboarding in terms of the gameplay, with the ability to get off your board and just like run around and do some climbing, as well as the addition of some driving sequences, which in my opinion were really badly done.
Thug 1 and 2 are my favorite.
Customization.
Yeah,
for example, how you could
Thug
email
1.
a photo of yourself to thugonline.com and use that as the face of your player character. And while I can appreciate a lot of that innovation, personally, this is where the series kind of lost me as a player. I know most people love this game, and I understand why, but for me, it started to get a little bit too goofy and too far away from what felt to me like real authentic.
You think this guy skates? He did say revert.
As far as the soundtrack goes, it was absolutely massive. It was by far the biggest one yet, with a total of 78 songs, divided up into 3 categories. The punk songs included Refused, No Effects, Rise Against, and Transplants. The rock category had In Flames, High on Fire, Queens of the Stone Age, and Clutch. And on the hip-hop side of things, more of the usual kind of backpacky stuff, like Cannibal Ox, Jurassic 5, and Merc. And it's kind of interesting because objectively, this is a really strong soundtrack, like top to bottom, solid stuff. But for some reason, I felt like this soundtrack had even less impact than the earlier games with less songs. And maybe that's why. Like maybe because there were so many songs, it was more difficult for any individual song to stand out. And I would say pretty much all the same things about the sequel, Tony Hawk's Underground 2. Which brings us to the next game, Tony Hawk's American Wasteland in 2005. And once again, the game puts you in the role of an amateur skateboarder who goes out to LA to do skateboarding things. And of course, all kinds of crazy things go wrong.
Are you serious? Dude, that'd be huge! The return of Iggy Van Sant, people would go crazy for it!
They also introduced some BMX sequences into the game, which to me felt kind of out of place, although they are pretty well done. And although there's really nothing objectively wrong with this game, it's really well made, the story is cool, all that, just for whatever reason, I personally really couldn't get into it. Because, at least for me, it felt like this is the game where the series had really kind of completely lost touch with anything that felt like authentic skateboarding. It had really gotten kind of ridiculous and cartoony. The main character wasn't
this
like
guy
a
is
pro.
kind of right.
And on the one hand,
what's
I
up.
completely understand that because people like me are not the target audience for this game. Like, they were not trying to impress people who grew up on Plan B and New Deal videos in the early 90s.
This guy is
Get
scary.
that? But still, it really just felt like kind of a cartoonish version of skateboarding to me. Almost more like those bad games of the 80s that I didn't like. Almost like the video game version of those cheap decks that they would sell at Walmart or whatever. But with that said, the soundtrack was...
You mean the Tony Hawk
the
signature
coolest
decks?
one in a while, especially all the covers. For this one, they got a bunch of bands who were, at the time, up-and-coming pop-punk and emo bands to do covers of the classic punk and hardcore bands that influenced them. For example, Rise Against covering Black Flag, Taking Back Sunday covering Descendants, Thrice covering Minor Threat, and my personal favorite, Fall Out Boy covering Gorilla Biscuits.
The only thing that felt authentic was Tony Hawk.
Another really good one is My Chemical Romance covering the Misfits. And this soundtrack was really cool for me.
A lot of
because
covers,
the guys in
yeah,
those
you were
bands
right.
are all kind of from the same
I
era
was not
and
right.
scene
I
as
did
I
not know
am.
that.
And those are all the bands that I also grew up on. So I thought it was really cool to see them use the massive platform of the Tony Hawk games as a way to shine a spotlight on some of those like classic hardcore bands. And although there were many
I beat all the
other
games.
in the series,
I didn't really play
this is
Proving
where
Ground
the
though
Tony
because
Hawk
we couldn't
series
get to work.
really
But other than
kinda
that, I
died.
beat them all.
Because Activision did what they always do.
When
with
will I
every
play 'em again
game they
next?
touch,
Is
which is to take a
good
great
question.
franchise, just really run it into the ground with annual sequels, bad ports, and spin-offs. The original developers Neversoft left the Tony Hawk series in 2007 to start focusing on Guitar Hero, which had kind of picked up the torch as being the game that would
What the
expose
heck?
young people to rock and metal bands in the same way as Tony Hawk did for the
Wait,
previous
is that real?
but still, even though
Was that
it
a
kind
real
of lost
ad,
its
or was
soul,
that
the
he-
series
did-
did Hawk, the game that to start the original run it with pretty much
That wasn't
how
Tony Hawk's
Soft
face,
left
right?
The Tony Hawk series in
That's just like
2007
AI.
to start focusing on Guitar Hero, which had kind of picked
It's real? What?
up the
Why does it look like AI?
as being the game that would expose young people to rock and metal bands in the same way as Tony Hawk did for the previous generation. But still, even though it had kind of lost its soul, the series
One of my
did
friends in
limit-
Australia, he was like, "Yo, I've been getting so into Guitar Hero. I love it. It's so fun. It feels like you're playing a real guitar." I was like, "Bro, why don't you just play guitar instead?" And then he was like, "Huh." He's like, "You know what? You're right." And then he started playing guitar, got super into it, and now like absolutely loves music and guitar. And he's like, "Yeah, I do kind of owe that to you, Ricky. Thanks." So shout out to
for
Rick.
several more years, with a bunch of pretty uninspired sequels and spin-offs and ports, until the last mainline game in the series,
Guitar
Pro
Hero is
Skater
definitely
5
nothing
in
like real guitar.
2015,
I mean, I'm
which
sure he'll
I've
tell you that
actually never
now, but
played,
that was before he
looks
had
horrible.
any kind of
And
music.
based on the fact that it has a Metacritic score of 39, I think I'm okay with never experiencing that one for myself. But although the series itself may be dead, its influence definitely lives on. The first few games in particular were a huge gateway into rock and metal for tens of millions of kids all over the world for many, many years. This series gave tons of really cool, important bands a platform that really helped their career, and most importantly, it created so many happy memories for an entire generation. Alright, my friends, that does it for this video. As always, let me know what you think in the comments, and I would like to thank everyone who supports me on
Yeah.
Patreon.
That was a good
especially
video.
those of you who
I like
support
this
at
guy.
the True Cult level or above. Patrons
The
get all my
Punk Rock MBA.